We're continuing our study of Song of Solomon today, looking at chapters 3 and 4. The title of our devotional is Looking Through the Eyes of Love. Do want to invite you to open your Bible and follow with us with today's study. Now, our love story in the Song of Solomon does continue with Song of Solomon 3 and chapter 4. Now, the implication of today's study is both literal and prophetic. I believe Solomon penned this love story as a young king, but I also consider it a beautiful depiction of God's love for his people. Now let's consider Song of Solomon chapter 3. In the first 3 verses, we have what I would describe as the dreams of young love. Now we find the young maiden dreaming of receiving Solomon as her husband in verses 1 and 2. She dreamed of marrying him. But with her wedding night approaching, she could not find the man she loved. She imagined that she had wandered the streets looking for Solomon. In her dream, she approached the watchmen, that is, the guards of the city, and she asked, "Saw ye him whom my soul loveth?" And then, when she found her groom, she held him tightly in verse 4 in her embrace, and she dare not let him depart until she led him to, quote, her mother's house. Look at the patience of young love in verse 5. Now, rejoicing she had found her beloved, she challenged other young maidens, that is, other daughters of Jerusalem. And what was her challenge? It was to be patient in the matter of love and marriage. In verse 5, "Stir not up, nor awake my love, and wait till he please." And what a blessed challenge and counsel to a young woman who longed for a lifetime companion and mate. In other words, the challenge of the maiden is to wait. Be patient. Don't stir up desires that cannot be righteously satisfied outside the bounds of marriage. Notice verse 6 through 11. And here we have the joy and happiness of young love. Now, our young maiden dreamed about her mysterious shepherd, and he, that is Solomon, had courted her lovingly and patiently. She dreamed of her wedding day and waited for him to come to her with his wedding party and claim her as his bride. One day, she looked towards the horizon, and she saw what appeared as a cloud of dust. It's described as pillars of smoke. An entourage approached and brought with it a fragrance of burning incense, we read, perfumed with myrrh and frankincense. Amid the caravan, she spied a royal litter, that is, a bed, which was Solomon's. Now, what a majestic presentation. In verse 8, the bed was borne by 60 valiant men carrying swords on their thighs. Solomon, no longer disguised as a shepherd, is the king of Israel and had come to claim his bride in verse 9. Imagine the pageantry and wonder of that moment. Her skin was tanned, darkened by the sun's rays, her hands calloused by her labors, and yet in verse 9 and 10 she was carried away on a bed of the finest wood of Lebanon. The young bride, overwhelmed by joy, urged her attendants, described as daughters of Zion, to behold their king wearing the crown given to him by his mother and perhaps adorned by her for his wedding day. Then consider Song of Solomon chapter 4. Now, and here we have in the first 7 verses, King Solomon boasting in the beauty of his bride. You know, our love story continued then with the groom having come to sweep away his bride on her wedding night. And though she was beautiful, she was of lowly means. And Solomon lovingly assured her, boasting of her beauty. The king's poetic portrayal of his bride is foreign to our concept of beauty. However, you and I must remember, he is looking at her through the eyes of love. The focus was not so much on how she looked, though she was physically beautiful to Solomon, but on how he felt when he looked at her. He regarded her beauty and gentle eyes, and we read in verse 1, "Thou hast dove's eyes within thy locks, Her hair flowed over her shoulders and reminded him in verse 1 of a flock of goats skipping down the slopes of Mount Gilead. Kind of unusual for us, and yet picturesque for Solomon. Her teeth were white like sheep shorn, which came up from the washing. In verse 3, her lips were red like a thread of scarlet. Her mouth was beautiful to behold, and her temples, that is, her cheeks, red like a piece of pomegranate and framed by the locks of her hair, in verse 3. Solomon described her neck as, quote, like the Tower of David, and her chastity like a great tower, not easily or quickly taken, in verse 4. The young king claimed her as his wife, and he said in verse 7, "Thou art all fair, my love. There is no spot," literally, there is no blemish in thee. Now consider verses 8 through 11, the groom's invitation to his bride. Solomon invited this young woman, his bride now, to come away with him. And we find in verse 8 he mentions 4 mountain peaks in northern Palestine. He professed she had stolen his heart in verse 9. He declared his physical attraction to his bride in verses 10 and 11. And he says, whose lips were sweet as the honeycomb and whose garments were the freshness of the outdoors. We find in verses 12 through 16 2 metaphors that describe Solomon's bride. The first was an enclosed garden, and the second, a fountain that was sealed. Enclosed and sealed portrayed that she had guarded her virtue and moral innocence. You see, she was a chaste woman, had given no man her favor. It was their wedding night, and Solomon tenderly took his young virgin to himself with 7 costly spices. The king described the precious nature of her love in verses 13 and 14. So the young bride accepted her husband, saying in verse 16, "Let my beloved come into his garden and eat his pleasant fruits." Well, a closing thought today. Cinderella's stories abound with the narratives of a peasant girl who falls in love with a handsome prince. But sadly, our society is robbing little girls of their innocence, and many parents fail to instill in their sons the qualities of a genteel, caring spirit. The beautiful love story in the Song of Solomon is more than an ancient tale of a king and his maiden. It portrays God's love for people of faith and Christ's love for his bride, the church. Well, such is the portrait given by the Apostle Paul in Ephesians 5, where we read in verse 25, "Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it." In verse 27, that he might present it to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that it should be holy and without blemish. You know, those are the qualities we should desire in a spouse. Those are the qualities we should instill in a son and a daughter. And those are also the same qualities God expects in you and me as believers, that we would be holy and without blemish. Well, thank you for being a part of this daily devotional. Bye-bye.